here and to talk about COAR and introduce COAR to perhaps some people who don't already know who we are. The first thing I wanted to do, though, before I introduce you to the organization is talk about three really important trends in scholarly communication and research that I think really frame a lot of the work that we do at COAR. Of course, open access. We all know that open access is quite rapidly now becoming the status quo, and we've seen funding agencies and governments around the world adopt open access policies and laws. Argentina, Peru, the European Commission, the United States, and so on. And so open access is becoming, as I said earlier, the status quo, and repositories are a very important part of supporting that. One of the other trends that we are seeing evolve in sort of the open access environment is that not only are our agencies adopting open access policies, but they're increasingly interested in tracking the open access content. So what's happening is that on top of repositories are being built some tracking systems to monitor when publications become open access, and probably even farther down the line what kind of impact those articles are having. So this is what OpenAIR is doing, and the SHARE system in the US. And I'm clicking through to the next, another slide, which I think is more related to open access. Expanding on open access to publications is the trend towards providing access to scientific data, and or the trend towards data sharing. We know that there are huge amounts of scientific data that are created that really have no infrastructure right now, and repositories have a very important role to play in terms of the long tail of research data. There are, if you look at this diagram and you see the head of scientific data, that's the kind of data that are collected in large disciplinary repositories, but there's a huge amount of data that's produced through research at research institutions or universities that are kind of very diverse and don't have a large disciplinary repository in which they could be deposited. So we're increasingly seeing a demand for local repository services to collect research data. And the third trend I wanted to talk about was this growing trend in international collaboration in research. And I apologize because this is a slide that I use in the Canadian context, but what it shows is the number of papers that are co-authored from somebody outside of the country. So, for example, if you look at the Canadian context, from 1999 to 2004, it was about 34%, and it has moved up 2005 to 2010 to 43%, and I expect now it's even higher. And that trend we see across most of the countries in the world. So in some cases, if you look at some countries, it's more than 50% of authors are co-authoring papers with a researcher from another country, which means there's a huge trend in international collaboration for research. So these are the trends, these are the three major trends that I point to that are really guiding the work that we do and our vision at COAR. And COAR improve the visibility and use of research outputs. So we were founded in 2009 in Ghent, Belgium, and the organization really evolved out of the DRIVER project, which was a European Commission funded project to build repositories in the European Union countries. And once that project was completed, it became obvious that repositories are not regional, they're global, and there needs to be some way of connecting repositories, not only across institutions, but nations and regions as well. So we've grown since our founding, where we started with 28 members, and we now have 100, I guess more than 100 institutions from 35 countries across the world. We are an extremely lightweight organization with just about 1.5 full-time employees. And our office is based in Göttingen, Germany, although I'm actually based in Montreal, Canada. We have a very diverse membership. We have universities and libraries, that's probably the most common, but we also have library associations, repository federations, we have research institutions, some government organizations and research funders, service providers, intergovernmental organizations, actually anyone who's interested in supporting international collaboration in the area of repositories. These are our principles, our sort of guiding principles. We're a global organization, so we really do want to represent the international community. We recognize that there is a lot of diversity globally with repositories. We think it's important to work at the strategic level, to work with policymakers, and have an influence in terms of the future of repositories and where they fit in terms of research infrastructure. We also develop our activities based on the interests of our members, so we're also a very grassroots organization. And we aim to support the adoption as much as possible of common approaches to policies, metadata schemas, and vocabularies, and that is to ensure that we have some level of interoperability across the repository community globally. So I usually say we kind of work in two areas. We work at the very practical level, and we also work at the strategic level. So at the practical level, we have three sort of very, very large working groups: repository content, interoperability, and training and education. And these groups are more umbrella groups for smaller interest groups, where most of the work is done in COAR is through smaller interest groups or task force. So in terms of the first working group, which is called repository content, really the aim of this group is to monitor best practices for recruiting content in repositories. We at one point talked about the development of overlay or value-added services, although we haven't really delved into that too much as of yet. We have recently published a report about incentives for populating repositories, actually sustainable practices, and that's available on the website. In terms of the smaller groups related to this big working group, we have a small task force that has been for the past 2 years now monitoring green open access clauses in the content licenses. So working with the consortial community to identify whether they're moving in the direction to be able to put those kind of clauses in their licenses with publishers, which would kind of address one of the barriers to depositing content into repositories. And we also have a new group that was just launched about 6 months ago called Repository Impact and Visibility. And what that group will be looking at is strategies for improving the visibility and impact of repositories, obviously, but the three major issues will be linked data, what are the practices for implementing linked data in repository content, optimizing metadata so that it is exposed as much as possible to search engines, and then also some practical marketing strategy for repositories within their communities. The second working group is repository interoperability, and this is a really important area for COAR. So here we try to promote interoperability standards and policies One of the things we're working on right now is an interoperability roadmap, and this roadmap is looking at all of the issues related to interoperability with repositories on two levels. First, between repositories, so interoperability between two repository systems or more, and then interoperability between repository systems and other types of systems. So what they're doing now is identifying priorities. They have an international group of sort of experts who have evaluated each of the interoperability issues and identified which one should be the priority for the group in terms of moving forward. So we should have a report about that coming out in the next month to 6 weeks. And I think that will be really informative for the repository community. We also have two smaller task forces or interest groups that's part of this working group. One is looking at usage data and beyond. So obviously usage data is a really important issue for repositories. We want to demonstrate that the content is being used. There are some issues with bots and how to measure usage appropriately. And then there are also issues of trying to come up with common methods for usage data across repositories so that we have measurements that we can use across the different repositories. The second group is a control vocabulary, and again, I think this is really important for interoperability. We have just taken over maintenance of a control vocabulary that was developed through the driver project, which was a very European-focused project. And what we would like to do now is bring in core members from other regions to be able to come to some agreement on some of the vocabulary elements, to be able to adopt some common vocabulary across regions. Okay, and the third working group is support and training for repository networks. And we have a collection of kind of training materials available on the website. We had at one point discussed whether we were going to be more active in terms of training, but we've kind of put that to the side right now. And right now, I guess the major focus for this group, or the smaller group within this group, is a task force that was launched about 6 or 9 months ago that's looking at competencies for librarians. And what the group is doing is looking at all of the new roles for libraries that are evolving in the past year, 2 years, and identifying specific competencies for these various roles. Probably not at too much of a detailed level, because you could find those things already. But this will really support library managers when they're looking for people to fill kind of new roles. And we also want to do an analysis of the commonalities across those roles in terms of competencies. So you might find that there's a lot of commonality between research data management, repository management, scholarly communication, and so on. So I expect that they will have a preliminary report out in the next 6 months or so. So those are our 3 major working groups. We are also getting more active in the area of research data, and we kind of spearheaded the launch of an interest group at the Research Data Alliance, which is a large umbrella group looking at research data and interoperability globally. This group, I think it's actually one of the most popular groups at RDA, because it already has 70 people that are members of the group, and anyone is actually welcome to join. If you go to the RDA website, you can just sign up for it. And really what the group has been doing now has been doing to date is sort of sharing best practices for managing long-tail research data. We had a meeting in Dublin last week, and we looked at, I think, 14 different profiles for managing research data, some external services, some library services, some disciplinary services. So it was really interesting to see how these kind of services are evolving. We also have the Repository Observatory, and this is managed by Alicia Lopez Mendez, who was the previous executive director of COAR. And what this does is sort of monitoring trends for repositories, trying to provide updates in terms of anything interesting or that might be on the radar for the repository community. So that's kind of a summary of our more practical activities. And as I said before, we also kind of work on the strategic level. And one of the things I wanted to just fill you in on today was a very new activity for COAR, which is to bring the major regional repository initiatives together to try to help further align their networks. So we had a meeting in Rome on the 20th and 21st of March where we brought together people from the SHARE project in the United States, Open Air representatives, people from China, Australia, Canada, and La Referencia in Latin America. And we had a really interesting discussion. We agreed that it can only benefit us to work together at the strategic level. It will ensure that that governments and other influential organizations know that we are working together and we're not creating silos. And so we agreed to work together under the auspices of COAR. We will probably be launching a strategic committee for this, and it's still sort of in discussion about how we will undertake the work, but we'll have some idea about that in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I just wanted to fill you in on some of the things that we discussed at that meeting. We agreed on some common principles: openness, regional diversity, that interoperability. We also agreed that across all regions we wanted to make a statement about embargo periods, and that we don't support embargo periods. We support the immediate open access to content. If there are to be embargo periods, then we would say a maximum of 6 to 12 months. We also identified certain areas where we thought were kind of the low-hanging fruit, where we could make some progress in terms of agreement. Author IDs, we would recommend ORCID. Persistent identifiers, the use of persistent identifiers in repositories. We would like to work on vocabulary for some specific elements, such as access and reuse conditions, embargoes, funding agency, names for funding agencies. And we also think that we could work together in terms of adopting some common approach to usage statistics, although that will probably take a little longer than some of the other areas. And we also agreed that we work together on looking at practices for managing research data, some level of interoperability for cross-system transfer or data exchange protocols, promoting the role of repositories in the area of research evaluation systems, and also to identify what kind of global research services exist and try to find, discuss ways in order to support those services more broadly. And so that's where that's sort of what the decisions that came out of that specific meeting, and I'm very hopeful and excited about what progress we can make at the strategic level, because I think working strategically together, we will have much more influence.